It's really hard to top the Sneaky Trickster Award. Our scripture this morning is actually not exactly what's printed in the bulletin. It is Luke 9, but it's verse 51 to 56. So if you want to make that adjustment, and as I will read to you out of the NSRV. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem. When his disciple James and John saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them. Then they went on to another village.
In January of 1977, the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research needed to develop a report about the future of Iran and its implications for the United States. About 25 years before that, the United States and United Kingdom governments had conspired together to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran and give more power to the ruling monarch. So 25 years in, they wanted to know, how was it going? So the State Department developed this report, and it begins, "Iran is likely to remain stable under the Shah or king's leadership over the next several years and committed to its relationship with the US as long as the Shah rules. The prospects are good that Iran will have relatively clear sailing until at least the mid-1980s. That's the introduction. And then there's a section on the stability of the regime, which begins, "The undercurrent of terrorist violence notwithstanding, the Shah rules Iran free from serious domestic threat." This is January 1977. And then in January of 1979, well, this happens.
Good evening. A tearful Shah of Iran left his country today on a vacation from which he may never return. And for the first time since violent anti-Shah protests began in Iran more than a year ago, there were celebrations in the streets of Tehran. Bob McNamara is there.
Chaotic celebrations erupted in Tehran when the news broke the Shah had gone. It was like Liberation Day. Martial law soldiers trapped in traffic were showered with scores of flowers and kisses. The same soldiers who were accused of murders, massacres, and atrocities in trying to keep the Shah in power. A newspaper with the headline, "Shah Leaves," was in the streets within minutes of his departure. And roving crowds chanted, "The Shah is defeated. Khomeini has won."
So in the span of just about 2 years exactly, it went from the US State Department's intelligence services believing that there would be stability and tranquility in Iran through the 1980s to an actual revolution. There's an academic by the name of Tamir Karan who says that revolutions that in hindsight seem to be the inevitable outcome of powerful social forces often surprise so many of their leaders, participants, victims, and observers. Even one of the primary architects and beneficiaries of this revolution, Khomeini, who was in France at the time, was caught off guard. He did not expect this to happen when it did. So we look back often with the benefit of hindsight at revolutions and we say, well, of course they happened when they did and the way that they did. But in the moment, they're often absolutely shocking events. No one expected it to happen as quickly as it did, or in the way that it did, or with the people that it did. We look back with hindsight and it makes sense, but in the moment it's surprising. We know two things to be true about the era that Jesus lived in. We know, for one, that there was no widespread violent revolution against Rome undertaken during Jesus' lifetime. And we know that within 30 years of the resurrection, there would be a violent revolution against Rome. So we can look back with the benefit of hindsight and say, well, of course this makes sense. But in the moment, I wonder how things would have felt. I've become increasingly convinced, and I can't prove this from the biblical text, but I've become increasingly convinced that Jesus navigated a very real possibility that his actions and ministry would be misinterpreted and that his own life would actually become the catalyst or the spark that ignited the very revolution he was trying to prevent. Again, I can't prove this, but I think it might help us make sense of some of the things we read in some of the Gospels, like about how protective Jesus was of his identity as the Messiah, that he wouldn't let people talk about the fact that he was the Messiah, or that he would heal people and then order them not to tell anyone about the healing. I think Jesus recognized that there's a very real risk of unintended consequences from his actions. And so it's worth asking, trying to get ourselves into the situation and context of the text and asking the question, was Jesus revolutionary? Was Jesus a revolutionary? Now again, most of us as followers of Jesus would look back and say, no, that's not quite the right category into which we should put Jesus. But there certainly are others who read the life of Jesus a little bit differently. One of those in the modern era, a scholar by the name of Reza Aslan, tries to put forth a very compelling argument that Jesus was in fact an aspiring and maybe even perhaps violent revolutionary. He wrote a book a few years back called Zealot. It caused a little bit of a stir when it was published. Maybe some of you have read it. He writes this. He says, the language of the kingdom of God is a call to revolution, plain and simple. And what revolution, especially one fought against an empire whose armies had ravaged the land, set aside by God for his chosen people, what revolution could be free of violence and bloodshed? He goes on to say, the common depiction of Jesus as an inveterate peacemaker who loved his enemies and turned the other cheek has been built mostly on Jesus' portrayal as an apolitical preacher with no interest in, or for that matter, knowledge of the politically turbulent world in which he lived. That picture of Jesus, Aslan claims, has already been shown to be a complete fabrication. The Jesus of history had a far more complex attitude toward violence. There's no evidence that Jesus himself openly advocated against violent actions, but he was certainly no pacifist. This is Aslan's conclusion, and he draws that both from a composite of other folks who functioned similarly to how Jesus functioned in his day and age, and then from cherry-picking a few portions of the New Testament, like Jesus' own declaration in the Gospel of Luke that he has not come to bring peace, but a sword. Or again, Jesus' actions in Luke where he tells his disciples to arm themselves with swords prior to his arrest in Gethsemane. But while Aslan is willing to take certain portions of the biblical text as accurate and historical, he rejects or fails to account for others, like this one that was just read for us from Luke 9. This is a hinge point, a pivot point in the Gospel of Luke. All of the action up until now in Jesus' life has been taking place in the northern region of Galilee. And then in chapter 9, verse 51, we have this statement. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, Jesus set his face, or some translations say set his face like flint, to go to Jerusalem. And so all of the narrative action shifts at this point. All of the Lucan text pivots around this point. Jesus has had this prolific ministry in Galilee, but now he is setting his face to go to Jerusalem. And you can interpret this as revolutionary action. Jesus has gathered a band of followers around him. He's demonstrated that he has power and authority over things like disease and unclean spirits and even the natural elements. And now Jesus is turning and marching toward the capital. But something unexpected happens along the way. Because separating Galilee from the south, where Jerusalem is this region inhabited by people known as Samaritans. And they share some similar history with Jewish people, but there were some differences. And so Samaritans have a slightly different understanding of their God and their worship and the place where people should worship. All of these are different. So Jesus has to come through this somewhat perhaps hostile territory to get down to Jerusalem. And the Samaritans are not interested in welcoming Jesus because he's oriented toward, his face is set toward, he's moving toward Jerusalem. He sees that as the epicenter of where the fulfillment of his ministry will take place. And Samaritans don't like that very much. And so as they're going through, they don't welcome him. And James and John ask this, what frankly, with hindsight, seems like a bizarre question. Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? And this is not a normal question that people ask. I imagine none of us have ever asked this question once in our lifetimes. But this is a question that actually would have made sense for James and John within the context that they're experiencing. It harkens back to an earlier story from the book of 2 Kings about the prophet Elijah. And the prophet Elijah is living when some of what would become the tensions between Samaritans and Jews were beginning to be established. There had been a civil war within the kingdom of Israel, and the northern tribes had broken off and become Israel, and the southern tribes had become Judah. And there was a king ruling in Israel who had a question about whether his sickness was going to lead to death. And so he sent some messengers to go inquire of a god, but not the God of Israel, and certainly not the God being worshipped in Jerusalem, a different God. But along the way, these messengers encounter a man named Elijah. He's a prophet. And he's sitting up on a hill, and he refuses to let these people pass to go inquire of this foreign God. And his question is there no God in Israel of which you can inquire? And so they go back and they tell the king about this wild, crazy-looking man that they encountered. And he says, that's that meddlesome prophet Elijah. And so he sends a commander of 50 men, 50 soldiers, to go and confront Elijah. And they say, man of God, come down from there. And he says, if I be a man of God, let fire from heaven come down and consume you and your 50. And in the story, fire from heaven comes down and consumes this captain and 50 men. And so the king sends another commander with his 50 men, and Elijah does the same thing. If I be a man of God, let fire from heaven come down and consume. And so this is James and John remembering an earlier story about divine violence brought about by a prophet. And remember, Jesus has styled himself in the mode of a prophet, and perhaps specifically in the mode of the prophet Elijah. And they remember this story. They say, Jesus, is this the time when you're going to do the thing? You're going to demonstrate the true power that you have. Fire from heaven is going to come down, consume these wicked Samaritans. This is the moment. And what does Jesus do? Jesus rebukes them. And I think this, more than anything else, both shows us that Jesus was not a revolutionary in the sense that Reza Aslan and others would want to understand it, someone using violence to pursue a political objective, but that Jesus' message and ministry were revolutionary. That perhaps we could say Jesus is pursuing and seeking after and ultimately attains the non-violent defeat of all violence. This is truly revolutionary. Jesus rebukes his disciples for wanting to rely on what we might now call divine violence. And this was part of their tradition. It had been well attested to in their scriptures. It was part of their understanding of how the world worked and how God worked. Of course, violence is going to be part of God's deliverance. But Jesus rebukes them. A biblical scholar by the name of Dale Allison has explored this text as well as some other extra-canonical writings that make similar arguments both about the case of Elijah in 1 Kings and also some of the other violence in the Old Testament. And he says this, he says, Jesus does not say that the disciples are asking for the right thing at the wrong time. Nor does he suggest that what is now wrong for his disciples was nonetheless once right for Elijah. Jesus' unelaborated rebuke seemingly implies that violent vengeance is wrong at all times and all places. This is the true revolution that Jesus brings about. He doesn't engage in violence the way that other aspiring or would-be revolutionaries do, but he actually seeks to undermine the very concept and structure and logic of violence itself. He's seeking to bring about the non-violent defeat of all violence. And so the revolution that Jesus brings about, perhaps we could say, is a revolution of humanity. It's not a revolution where one group of people seizes power over another group of people who had power, and then there's a cascade of further violence from that, and further violence, and just a spiral and a cycle of endless violence and recrimination and retribution. It is Jesus ushering in, inaugurating a way to live that is not reliant on violence. It is a revolution within humanity itself. Now, by many of the criteria that we would use to evaluate whether a movement is successful or unsuccessful, we might say, well, that doesn't really pass the test. Did Jesus actually really accomplish anything? Rome is still ruling. There still will be a violent revolution 30 years after the resurrection. Does Jesus actually do anything? What does he actually accomplish? There's an historian by the name of Tom Holland. He's also British like the actor, but they're not the same person. At least I'm pretty sure they're not the same person, because I can't see the Spider-Man guy doing all of this deep historical work. But Tom Holland, like Reza Aslan, writes from the perspective of someone who is not Christian, very openly and publicly so. I think he would describe himself as an agnostic or perhaps even an atheist. But he's studied in depth and historically the Roman era, and as he's studied it, he's recognized, I'm not actually the intellectual heir of Roman ways of thinking. The ways they thought and acted, their implicit values and assumptions are very alien, strange, and foreign to me. And Tom Holland tried to understand why that is, because the British Empire, of course, emerges out of the Roman Empire. There's a very strong direct connection, but the way most people in the West think today is drastically different from the ways Greeks or Romans would have thought. And Holland, as someone who does not believe in God, attributes this to Jesus and to Christianity. I want to share with you what he says. It's a little bit of a longer quote, so try to stay with me. He says this: "To be a Christian is to believe that God became man and suffered a death as terrible as any mortal has ever suffered. This is why the cross, that ancient implement of torture, remains what it always has been, the fitting symbol of the Christian revolution. It is the audacity of it, the audacity of finding in a twisted and defeated corpse the glory of the creator of the universe. And this audacity serves to explain more surely than anything else the sheer strangeness of Christianity and the civilization to which it gave birth. Today, the power of this strangeness remains as alive as it ever has been. It is manifest in the great surge of conversions to Christian faith that has swept Africa and Asia over the past century. It's present in the conviction of millions upon millions of practicing Christians that the breath of the Spirit, like a living fire, still blows upon the world. And, at least in Europe and North America, it's present in the assumptions of many more millions who would never think to describe themselves as Christians. But they have assumptions like all human beings have rights. All human beings are born equal. All human beings are owed sustenance and shelter and refuge from persecution. These were never self-evident truths. All, he says, all are heirs to the same revolution, a revolution that has at its molten heart the image of God dead on a cross. And so Holland says the great disconnect between what the implicit, intuitive assumptions he makes about life and the universe and everything, these are not fundamentally indebted to Roman thinking, but to Christian thinking. Now, I would push out a little further and say that what gives Christianity its power is not just the image of God dead on a cross, but of the resurrection as well. Holland, as a skeptic, is not willing to quite go there. But even he recognizes and acknowledges that there has been this revolution within human hearts and minds. That humanity has been reshaped at the intuitive, implicit, assumptive level. The things we know to be true before we even stop to think about them, these have been fundamentally changed by the ministry and message of Jesus. Rejecting violence, seeking to love enemies. And so if this is as revolutionary as Tom Holland, as well as other prominent skeptics like Bart Ehrman, acknowledge that it is, if it is truly as revolutionary as they say, I think the question for us is, where are my loyalties? Loyalties can shift quickly in a revolution. I'm so struck by this imagery of Iranian soldiers who had been part of this brutal, repressive state regime, all of a sudden being greeted and welcomed by their fellow countrymen. Because loyalties were shifting rapidly. Loyalty was going away from the Shah, who was fleeing the country, and loyalties were going to the new revolutionary government and to the people. Revolutions change loyalties quickly. And so for us, the question remains, where are my loyalties? Are my loyalties to the power of violence to achieve the objectives that I seek? Or are my loyalties with Jesus, who shows this nonviolent, revolutionary way of loving enemies, of transforming conflict itself, of killing not enemies, but enmity itself, of destroying hatred? Where are my loyalties? I want to close with a snapshot of what it can look like when our loyalties align with Jesus. About 11 years after the revolution in Iran, there was a devastating earthquake in a city just a little bit northwest of Tehran. Somewhere between 35 and 45,000 people were killed. 60 to 100,000 people were injured. Estimates say up to 400,000 people were displaced. It was a brutal, brutal earthquake. And there's a guy not far from here in Akron who was working for MCC at the time who said, we ought to do something to help. MCC had no presence in Iran. There was no diplomatic relationship between the United States and Iran. But they knew of a guy in Canada who was a Canadian Iranian who still had some connections, who was trying to get some efforts together to create relief. And MCC said, well, we have some money, and we have access to some food, and we have access to some school kits. Is there any chance you could help us get these to Iran? And sure enough, they did. And in addition to that, in addition to the actual direct material relief, they arranged for visas for 4 people, 2 Canadians and 2 Americans, all Mennonite, to go to Iran and meet with representatives of the Iranian Red Crescent Society to talk about what relief and development could look like in this region. And so these folks from MCC fly from the US and Canada. They get their visas. Like literally one of them has to fly to Ottawa to pick up his visa and then go to Iran. Like it was crazy. But they get there and they strike up a very real and lasting and meaningful relationship with senior leaders of the Iranian Red Crescent Society. And they make a long-term funding commitment, and they say, we're going to provide funding to build 15 health clinics in the region that has been so devastated by this earthquake, which already was a very impoverished and underdeveloped region. And so this work commenced, MCC raising money and providing resources, Iranians doing the building work. But they weren't quite content. They recognized this emerging rhetoric that political Islam was going to become the great adversary of American foreign policy in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They said, what would it look like to try to build relationships, to not just transfer money or material aid, but to actually try to build relationships? And so they came up with this pilot program where they would send some American scholars to study at an Iranian theological institute in Qom. And the Iranian Theological Institute would send some folks to study at University of Waterloo. And this exchange happened, and there was a few Iranians that stayed for 5-6 years, a few that stayed for 10-12 years. And there were Americans and Canadians overseas studying in Iran. And then they said, well, what if not just scholars, but actual experts in the field came together? What if we began hosting interfaith dialogues between Shia Islamic leaders in Iran and Mennonite and other Christian theologians in Canada and the United States? And so for the past 20 plus years, well, there has been such horrible and often hateful rhetoric from the United States toward Iran. There have been these exchanges happening. Iranian clerics, American scholars meeting together, Americans and Canadians going to Qom, or this group of people here, 3 Iranian scholars who came to Canada at Canadian Mennonite University to get together and talk about things like the philosophy of religion, ethics, monotheism, subjects where there might be real and lasting difference. And at one point, while these conversations are happening and all of this, there's a tremendous surge of interest in the United States about the possibility of war with Iran, a war that some were concerned might actually turn nuclear. And so again, MCC is saying, what can we do? How can we reach out to this? And so one of their staff people reached out to one of his contacts in the Iranian government. He actually flew to Geneva to meet with him, and he said, do you think it would be possible for us to bring some American scholars to come over and really specifically talk about peace? What would it look like if we as citizens tried to work diligently to prevent war? They said, we've been trying to come, but our visas keep getting denied. And this guy in Geneva says, well, one of those students who studied in Canada, he's actually pretty high up in the government now. Maybe he can help you get some visas. And so they reached out to him, and he said, actually, I don't know that I can do that, but Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, then the president of Iran, is coming to the United Nations to deliver a speech. What would you think about meeting with him, with some religious leaders after his speech is over? And so for 3 years in a row, well, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was coming to the United Nations and delivering these fiery speeches denouncing the West. He would leave those speeches and he would go and meet with some Mennonites and other Christian religious leaders to talk about peace. I actually had the pleasure of having coffee with one of the leaders of this initiative last night. I don't know too many people who live in Akron and have met 2 different presidents of Iran, but he has. And he has these deep and meaningful friendships across significant difference, but true, meaningful friendships. Friendships that seek to pursue peace in the face of overwhelming threats of violence. This is the revolutionary power of Jesus' message. It is not a revolution that overcomes force with superior force, but a revolution that undermines the logic of violence itself and replaces enmity with love and compassion. It's so important for us to choose where our loyalties lie. There's just one of these gatherings last year in Qom of Iranian and American and Canadian scholars coming together to talk. And there was a journalist there observing it, and she wrote an article in the Christian Century that was published this week. And she reports on the remarks of one of these Iranian scholars about the importance of dialogue. And he says, dialogue is kebab. It's food. It's sitting down around the table. If there is no kebab, he says there's no dialogue. And maybe this is why one of the most lasting and enduring symbols that Jesus left to empower this revolutionary movement is the sharing of food together. So we're going to partake of that, and I know it might not be quite as rich and meaningful as actually sitting around a table and sharing a full meal and all the conversation and richness that comes with that. But symbolically, that is what communion is about. It's about friends and foes coming together at table and encountering the revolutionary power of Jesus to transform the way that we relate. And so I'd invite our communion servers to come forward as we prepare to partake of the elements together. Communion here at Forest Hills is open to all who have been baptized. We see this as an affirmation of our baptismal vows, our commitment to follow in the revolutionary way of Jesus. If you haven't been baptized but still want to participate, Dora's going to be available to offer prayer of blessing for you. The ushers will be coming around to dismiss you by row. And I remind us that Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, gathered his disciples together around a table. And he took bread, and after giving thanks for it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body broken for you." And in the same way, Jesus took the cup, and after giving thanks for it, he offered it to his disciples, saying, "This is my blood of the new covenant, shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." So as often as we eat of this bread and drink of this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. And we pledge our allegiance to Jesus' revolutionary way of loving enemies. I invite you to come and receive the gifts of God for the people of God.